بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Alhamdulillah, we now are beginning the final section of the Fiqh of Purification, and that is the section on menstruation and postnatal bleeding. Now, before we continue, these rulings are not just for women to study, by the way. They're also for men to study because you might be in a situation where you marry someone who might have some questions, or you might have some siblings that might have some questions. You might have some daughters that might have some questions, and so on. And even some rulings in this section also directly relate to the man. So, for example, in the topic of divorce, right? And these are things that we're all going to touch on in this lesson today. So that's why it's very important to study this topic to great depth for just not just sisters, but also brothers as well. So let's get started. What exactly is considered a period? How do we know that a sister has begun her period? The scholars, they've said that even if a tiny amount of blood has come out from the front, whatever the color of that blood, so it could be red, it could be yellowish, it could be dark red, it could even look a bit brown. So long as a tiny amount of blood comes out, it would be considered menstrual blood, and the rulings of menstruation would apply to that woman. This blood must have come out by itself, not because you've hurt yourself, for example, or because of medicine. This blood must have come out by itself for it to be considered as menstrual blood. And likewise, this blood wouldn't be considered period blood if it comes from someone that's way too young, so less than 9 years old, for example, or someone way too old who's gone through menopause at around 50 years or older, or something along those lines, right? So this is kind of the boundaries, if you like, of what is considered period blood and what is not considered period blood. طيب. Since we're on this topic, let's now speak a bit about divorce, clear that out, and then we can go straight into the main rulings for menstruation. Regarding divorce, when a woman divorces her husband, you might or might not know that she has to wait 3 cycles in order to be able to marry someone else, 3 period cycles. Now, do you remember at the beginning, just a second ago, we said that if a tiny amount of blood comes out, this would be considered a period? This does not apply when counting a cycle after divorce. A cycle can only be counted as a cycle if a woman bleeds for half a day at least. If a tiny amount of blood comes out, the rulings of period still apply. But to count one cycle of the 3 cycles after divorce, the woman must be bleeding consistently for at least half a day. From a man's perspective, and this is where you're going to see why these rulings are important for a man as well, it's actually haram to divorce a woman during her period. It's haram. And in the presence of a judge, the judge would force the man to remarry the wife that he divorced during her period. And if he refuses, there would be a punishment for him as well. And that divorce would still count even though he makes them remarry. Why are they forced to remarry? Because if you divorce a woman during her period, this makes the waiting period of her 3 cycles way longer because the period she's in would not count as a cycle. So it actually put hardship on the sister. So if someone actually divorces their wife during her period, they'll have committed a sin, they have to remarry, the divorce still counts, and if they decide to divorce again, then that would be the second divorce counted out of the 3 that they're allowed. Do you see? So now we are ready to start with the general menstruation rulings, inshallah ta'ala. طيب. A period can never last for more than 15 days. 15 days is the absolute maximum. Any bleeding a sister sees after 15 days can be ignored, and that sister can pray and fast normally after doing ghusl. Similarly, there must also be a minimum of 15 days that have passed since the end of the period to consider any new bleeding a brand new period. Does that make sense? And so you have the 15-day period where she's been bleeding. Once she becomes pure, 15 days must pass at least before any new blood is considered a new period. Does that make sense? And so how does a woman know when her period has stopped so that she can do all the counting? The scholars, they've mentioned 2 signs. The first sign is known as qassa, okay? Qassa is basically where you have a white liquid that comes out and it has no traces of blood whatsoever. This is one of the signs that a period has stopped. The second sign is known as jufuf. And this is where a sister, she basically puts a white cloth down there or a tissue or something like that. And when she looks at it, there's zero coloring when she looks at it. There's no color whatsoever. If one of these two signs take place, that means the sister is now pure, she's ready to do ghusl, and then she's ready to now basically go back to worshipping Allah, as normal. And we'll talk about what exactly she can and can't do when she's on or off her period soon, inshallah. So these are the general rulings. The 15 days maximum, 15 days minimum for purity, and then you count a new period after those minimum 15 days, with those two signs being the determining factor if she becomes pure or not. Now we're ready to build on these rulings. There are three categories of women when it comes to the rulings of menstruation. And this is where maybe it will get a little bit complex, but I'm sure you guys will understand it if I go nice and slow, inshallah. The first category is known as a mubtadi'ah. This is a woman who's just got her very, very first period. She's never had a period before. This is the first category, a mubtadi'ah. Then you have the second category, which is a mu'tada. This is a woman who's had multiple cycles and she knows her usual period length. Okay. The third category of woman is hamil, a pregnant woman. Sometimes when women are pregnant, they actually bleed during their pregnancy, and this would actually take the rulings of menstruation as we're about to discuss. Now, regarding the first category, mubtadi'ah, a woman who's just got her very first period. This general ruling of 15 days maximum bleeding applies 100% of the time to this sister. She's never had a cycle before, so she doesn't know how long her period is, and so 100% of the time she has maximum 15 days of bleeding before she has to become pure again. Meaning, if she bleeds on day 16, that blood can be ignored and she would be pure and she would pray and fast and do everything as normal, even if there's still blood on day 16. But when it comes to the second category, the mu'tada, the woman who basically knows how long her usual period is, the 15-day limit still applies, but the Sharia takes into account her usual period length. So if the usual length of the woman's period is, let's say, 7 days, and she bleeds for more than 7 days, does she wait until the 15-day limit? No. The woman can bleed for 3 extra days more than her usual before becoming pure. So if a woman's usual cycle is 7 days, okay, and she, in her next period, she's bleeding on day 8, she's still on her period. Day 9, she's still on her period. Day 10, she's still on her period because that's 3 days on top of her usual. Day 11, even if she's still bleeding, she's not considered on her period anymore. She does ghusl and she goes back to spiritual purity. Does that make sense? طيب, what if the usual period length of a woman is 13 days? Does she get an extra 3 days? No, because if you add 3 days to 13, that would be 16. But we said that the maximum is 15 days. Do you understand? And so the plus 3 days applies so long as it's less than 15 days maximum. And that's where the 3-day allowance comes in. So, to summarize, a woman that is from the second category, a mu'tada, who knows her usual period length, let's say it's 7 or 8 or 9, whatever it is, she gets an extra 3 days on top of that where she remains on her cycle, on her period, so long as that does not exceed 15 days. And after those 3 days are finished, then she would basically go back to doing ghusl and praying, etc., even if there's still blood there. Do you understand? طيب. What are some anomalies? Because there are some sisters that have some anomalies here and there, and these are very important to know as well. What if the sister doesn't know her usual number of days because every month is different? 1 month her period is 7 days. The next month it's 9 days. The one after that is 6 days. This can happen. If that's the case, the sister takes the length of the last cycle and uses that as her usual. So if the last cycle was 6 days, this next cycle, she takes 6 days as her usual, plus 3 days, which would be 9, and then she would basically go back to purity if she bleeds on day 10. Does that make sense? Play. That's the first anomaly. The second anomaly, what if the sister can't remember her last cycle's length? So she thinks back and she thinks, oh, maybe it was 4 days, maybe it was 5 days, I can't remember exactly. In that case, the sister would take a minimum estimate and a maximum estimate, and then she would take the maximum as her usual, okay? Then she would plus 3 days on top of that. So let's say sister can't remember and she goes, okay, last month my period could have been 5 days long. Actually, maybe it could have been 7 days long. That's the range, 5 and 7. So then she goes with 7, adds 3 days, that's 10 days altogether. If she's still bleeding on 11 days, she does ghusl and then she goes back to being normal once again, pure, basically. Okay? So what's the third anomaly? The third anomaly, which is a common anomaly, is when a sister's period basically stops and then comes back. So do you remember the two signs that we mentioned at the beginning to know if your period stopped or not? Qassa, jufuf, the white liquid or putting a white cloth, and then there's no trace of blood in either of them. If a sister gets one of these signs, but then after a few days the period comes back, so it stops for a few days, then it comes back for a few days, stops for a few days and comes back for a few days. What should she do in that case? In that case, the sister needs to count the days she's on and discount, not count, the days that she's off until she reaches her usual plus 3 days. So for example, it gets a little bit confusing. Let's say the sister's period is 7 days long, okay? So that means if we plus 3, she has 10-day allowance, where if she's bleeding on day 11, she's not on her period anymore, even if she's bleeding. So let's say she comes onto her period on Monday, and Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, she bled, but then it stopped. She's like, oh, I've got the purity, like I've got qassa or jufuf. That means I've got to do ghusl and go back to pray, right? I forgot what day we're on. Let's say we're on Saturday. Saturday, Sunday, Monday, she's off her period, so she khalas, there's nothing there, and then it comes back on Monday. So then she discards these 3 days, and now she's on day 6. So she's only bled 6 days, even though 9 days have passed. And then she counts the days that she's bleeding again. And if it stops again, she stops counting. And then she continues counting until she reaches her usual plus 3. Then she stops. And then from there, she counts 15 days of purity before any new blood counts as a new period. Do you understand? So when it comes to cutting, yeah, when the period stops and comes back, you only count the days you're bleeding. And until you reach your usual plus 3, that's when you go back to ritual purity once those days are over, even if there's still blood. طيب. That summarizes in depth most 99% of the rulings of menstruation. طيب, what about category 3? Pregnant women. We said that pregnant women, sometimes they might bleed whilst they're pregnant. The rulings of menstruation also apply to pregnant women, but there's a very small difference. The only difference is the maximum amount of days that a pregnant woman can bleed. For category 1 and 2, we said the maximum is 15. For a woman that's pregnant, if she's pregnant from 0 days all the way until 3 months, then she stays 15 days. If she bleeds in from 0 days all the way to 3 months, if she bleeds and has her, blood during her pregnancy, she gets maximum 15 days. Then between 3 months and 6 months, the maximum goes up to 20 days. And from 6 months until the end of her pregnancy, the maximum becomes 30 days. Meaning, if she bleeds from 6 months onwards, and she's bleeding every single day for 28 days, 29 days, 30 days, she doesn't need to pray, she doesn't need to do anything. And then only on day 31 would she then have to go back to her spiritual purity. And that's it. That's the only difference. Everything else we've mentioned about the cutting, the signs of a period, etc., everything else we've mentioned applies to the pregnant woman. طيب, what about postnatal bleeding? Postnatal bleeding is when a sister, she gives birth and then she starts bleeding after giving birth. Again, the only difference is just the maximum amount of days that she can bleed before she has to go back to spiritual purity. Everything else is the same. The maximum days for someone who is going through postnatal bleeding is 60 days. So a sister who's got postnatal bleeding can bleed for 60 days consecutively, and she wouldn't need to pray, she wouldn't need to do anything. On day 61, if she's still bleeding, she would go back to purity and she would go back to praying, etc., etc. But everything else basically counts. And so when the 60 days are over, or when the postnatal bleeding stops, if 15 days of purity pass, then the next blood is basically considered a normal cycle. Okay, so that summarizes the vast majority of the rulings. طيب, what can you and can't you do whilst on your period? Number 1, You can't pray or fast. If you're fasting, you have to break your fast. And if the fast is an obligatory fast, so Ramadan fast, you have to make it up. And this is really sad for many sisters because they spend all day in the heat and they're fasting and there's no food, no water. And right until the end where they prepare the date and the water, they're about to drink because there's 2 minutes left. They realize they've come on and they actually have to repeat that fast and they have to break their fast there and then, and it would be invalid. Sad story, but it happens quite a lot. طيب, regarding praying, any prayers that you miss during your menstrual cycle, you don't need to make them up either. This is a mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you miss, 6 days of prayer, 7 days of prayer, you don't need to make it up. Likewise, if you come on your period during Dhuhr or during Asr or during Maghrib and Isha or Fajr and you don't pray that prayer, you don't need to make that up either. So if you come on during Dhuhr and you've not prayed Dhuhr, then you don't need to make it up when you become pure again. Okay, so that's the first thing. You can't pray or fast. The second thing is you cannot do tawaf around the Kaaba. Because what is tawaf? Tawaf is just tahiyatul masjid. When you go into the masjid, the sunnah is to pray 2 units. Tawaf around the Kaaba is considered tahiyatul masjid for the Kaaba. And so because it's a form of prayer, you can't do that either. And so that's something you're not allowed to do if you are on your period. But with that said, if you do plan to go Umrah or Hajj, it's perfectly fine for you to take any contraception to delay your period so that you're not in a position where you've wasted your money, you've wasted your efforts, and you can't do Umrah or Hajj because of your period. Does that make sense? So you can actually take contraception. The third thing is you cannot enter the masjid. All madhabs agree on this. You cannot enter the place where you pray, the main masjid area, right? Like I said, all madhahib, they agree on this. The super, super vast majority of scholars, they agree on this. However, if you're in the West, there is a very small opinion that can apply to the mosques in the West. You see, when you look at the mosques in the West are like centers for upholding the deen. Where outside the mosque, there's fitna everywhere, there's non-Islamic environment. The mosque is a place where it fosters an Islamic environment. So you have things like events, you have things like charity kind of stuff going on. You have classes going on in the masjid. It's a center to uphold the deen. And so the minority opinion we mentioned can apply to mosques in the West if there's a need for you to be there. So for example, if you're on your period and you have a event you need to volunteer at, or you need to attend a class and you just like without this class you're gonna, you'll feel like you've been looking forward to this class and you want to benefit from it and so on and so forth. If there's a need for you to go, then you can go. But if you can get away without going, then it's better for you not to go because of this super vast majority opinion. Okay. Number 4, you cannot touch a complete Quran that is Arabic, start to finish, even with a barrier, by the way. You can't touch a Quran at all, even with a barrier. But if it's a part of a Quran, so let's say just like a few juz', or even if one page is missing from the Quran, or even one ayah, if it's an incomplete Quran, you can touch it, and that's perfectly fine. Similarly, if you have a Quran with translation, right? So you have the Arabic and English, even if it's the full Quran, you can touch it. If it's on your phone, you can touch it. And you can also even recite from memory. But when it comes to reciting from memory, this only applies to sisters who are menstruating, not to those of major impurity. Maybe they've had sexual intercourse or something like that. Even they cannot recite the Quran, but menstruating sisters can. Okay? So only when the Quran is complete and it's Arabic only, then you cannot touch it, but everything else is pretty much fine. Number 5, when you're on your period, you cannot engage in intercourse. That's completely forbidden. And number 6, you cannot engage in foreplay if there's no barrier. If there's a barrier, like there's clothes in between and etc., then you can engage in foreplay in that area. If you know what I'm talking about, the private area, right? But without a barrier, you're not allowed to engage in foreplay. So that's the do's and don'ts, basically. طيب. The final section is what prayers do you make up when you finish your period? So we've spoken about everything else. Now it's about the prayers that you make up when you come off your period. If you come off your period during Dhuhr, then pray Dhuhr. If you come off your period during Asr, then you pray Dhuhr and Asr. Yeah? So I'll repeat that. If you come off your period during the Dhuhr period, the Dhuhr time, then you only pray Dhuhr. If you come off your period during the Asr time, then you pray Dhuhr and Asr. If you come off your period during Maghrib, then you pray Maghrib. And if you come off your period during Isha, then you pray Maghrib and Isha. And finally, if you come off your period during Fajr, you just pray Fajr. You see? So that's the general theme. Now you sisters can think, okay, if I come off my period during this time, I either pray Dhuhr or Dhuhr and Asr or Maghrib and Isha. Do you understand? طيب. Final question, and this is where it might be probably the most complex part of the entire class. What if you become pure right before the prayer? So there's only like 15 minutes left, or if you're outside the house. You know, maybe you're in the shops or you're doing something, you're coming back from school, university. What do you do in that case? Because now you know we have to pray a certain prayer, but you're outside or you can't, or there's only 10 minutes left. What's the rulings for that? طيب. Let's say you get one of the two signs of purity, qassa or jufuf, and there's like 15 minutes left until the prayer finishes. The Sharia, pay attention, the Sharia takes into account the amount of time that you need to, number one, look for something to become pure with. So either water for ghusl or a rock for tayammum, okay? So physically looking for that thing or going to get that thing. Number two, to actually become pure. So the time it takes you to do ghusl, which might be 20 minutes, or tayammum, which is just 1 or 2 minutes, that's also taken into consideration. And then number three, catching 2 units of the prayer before the time finishes. If you catch 2 units of Isha and Isha finishes, you've caught the prayer in the Maliki Madhab, as we discussed. Those 3 times combined, if you basically have enough time for all these 3, then you have to make up the prayer that you're about to basically do. So if it happens in Asr time and there's half an hour left until Asr, you pray Asr basically until it finishes. But in that half an hour, you can find water, you can do ghusl, and you can pray. Then you have to do that. Similarly, if you don't have enough time to do ghusl, then you go to tayammum, right? And so if you have like 15 minutes left until Asr, you think, can I do ghusl? You say, no, okay. Now I need to do tayammum then. Do I have enough time in these 15 minutes to go find something to do tayammum and then do tayammum and pray Asr? If the answer is yes, you have to do tayammum. Does that make sense? If the answer is no to both of those, where if you look for water or a rock and you can't do, you can't do tayammum or ghusl, and there's nothing you can do from that moment, then you don't need to make up these prayers or pray them at all, as we discussed a few lessons ago as well. And so that is the general rulings altogether. The last one that I'm going to mention, pay attention. If you guys are shopping and you're outside, does that still apply? Because if you're shopping, you might think, okay, if I get home and then do I need to make up? Do I not need to make up? Pay attention, okay? If you're shopping and you get one of the 2 signs that you're pure, if there and then you set off straight away to try and get water, to do your ghusl, and then to make up the prayer, and you miss it, you don't need to make it up. But sometimes when you're out, you might be thinking, oh, let me finish my shopping. Let me finish doing this. Let me finish doing that. The Sharia doesn't count this time in. Does that make sense? So if you decide when you're shopping, let me just go to one more shop, or let me just pay for this, or let me do that, then you would have to make up the prayers that you miss, even if the time finishes. Because the Sharia only takes into account the time that you look for the thing to purify yourself with, to purify yourself and catch the prayer. Do you understand? And so now, I promise you, if you've internalized everything I've said, you are masters in the fiqh of menstruation. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. جزاكم الله خيرا.